Hello, everybody. George from Ireland. So, welcome back to my channel once more. What a lovely view of my kitchen and the sink behind. Anyway, so it's just gone 20 years since the liberation of Iraq commenced, because it was the 19th of March 2003 when the coalition of the willing entered Iraq. The Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein was in breach of multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions that China and Russia voted for, as well as the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, and a majority of the non-permanent members of the UN Security Council. So we all know that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and indeed had declared them in its 1991 inventory. So chemical weapons, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons program hadn't perfected nuclear weapons. And the 1991 ceasefire was then contingent upon Iraq disarming itself in a verifiable manner as specified by the United Nations weapons inspectors. So Iraq repeatedly refused to do so, refused to cooperate with the weapons inspectors, eventually withdrawn in 1998, went back in. They still weren't getting fulsome cooperation. There was a no-fly zone in southern Iraq, and there were regular air raids aimed at degrading the Iraqi military's capability. Of course, the Saddam Hussein regime had committed genocide against its own Kurdish citizens. In the 1980s, the notorious Halabja attacks, killing 3,000 civilians almost instantly, and then obviously invading Kuwait in 1990, illegally occupying a sovereign state, attempting its annexation within the Republic of Iraq. So it was seen as a threat to its neighbors. But anyway, so the February 2003 resolution said that Iraq must immediately, unconditionally, fully cooperate with the weapons inspectors, otherwise serious consequences could flow. Bearing in mind that there are regular air raids in Iraq, the only thing more serious than that had to be a ground invasion. Now, there was a push for another UN resolution to explicitly authorize the use of force on the ground, but that failed. Actually, France rejected it before even Russia and China did. But nevertheless, the United States, the United Kingdom, and dozens of other countries felt this was sufficient, and they went ahead to free Iraq. And of course, as the Iraqi National Accord, the various Iraqi democratic groups who are fighting for human rights in Iraq against one of the cruelest tyrannies in the world, the Iraqi Kurds have been fighting for decades as well. So some people say, oh, you started a war. There already was a war. There'd been a war for decades in Iraq before March 2003. What this did was not to start a war, it was to end a war. So they're getting to Baghdad within a month. And then it went quite well. People were jubilant to have defeated the tyrant. But how long was the Coalition Provisional Authority going to be there? The Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime having been ousted, the United States and her allies had to provide some sort of civilian administration, which they attempted to do. Paul L. Bremer, an American security advisor, he was there to be the provisional governor, and he left a year later. It was going quite well for a few months, but when are you going to withdraw? And President George W. Bush prematurely landed an aircraft carrier with a big banner behind it, mission accomplished, and declared all major combat operations over. It was going quite well. A lot of Iraqi prisoners of war had been taken. They were quickly released, and the Iraqi army melted away. Their barracks were stripped, and they just took off the uniforms and went back to civilian life. So probably one of the cardinal errors of the Coalition Provisional Authority was to dissolve the Iraqi army, which made hundreds of thousands of men unemployed. And quite soon, there started to be an insurgency, terrorism, some would say. Some of them were Ba'athist elements, as in still supported Saddam Hussein. Some of them were Sunni fundamentalists, of course. Some of them were Shia fundamentalists. Now, Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. About 20% of Iraqis are native speakers of Arabic and Sunni. Right, there's a Kurdish minority, about 20% of the population. They're also Sunnis, but the Kurdish is their language, a separate ethnic group. The Shia are the majority, Arabic-speaking Shia, about 55%. There are various other small minorities like Chaldean Christians, Yazidis, Marsh Arabs, and so forth. Some Bedouin tribes out in the desert. But anyway, Al Qaeda became involved. Some of the Shia militias were backed by Iran. It became a multi-sided civil war, which went on for a few years. But many countries sent troops, countries you don't hear about very much, like Romania, Poland, Ukraine sent soldiers and so on to curry favor with the United States. So some Americans say, oh, what's Ukraine ever done for us? Ukraine sent soldiers to help the United States in Iraq and indeed in Afghanistan. So George W. Bush was very popular. Remember, after 9/11, he said, he couldn't run the risk that Saddam Hussein would develop nuclear weapons and give them to Al-Qaeda. Now, Saddam Hussein had been a secularist to begin with, but was becoming more religious fundamentalist towards the end, implementing Sharia law, putting Allahu Akbar on the flag. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the sentiment, Allahu Akbar. If you're an observant Muslim, you want to say God is great, nothing wrong with that. Not against people being observant Muslims and so on, not so keen on Sharia law. But anyway, they did have elections in January 2005, and Iraq had its first fair elections in decades. And so eventually there was a functioning government for the United States, obviously, to hand over to. And in 2011, under President Barack Obama, the United States withdrew. It was under Gordon Brown that the British Army had withdrawn and so on. So yes, people were killed. It's probably with the United Nations weapons because the default says yes, he fully immediately cooperated with the United Nations. The war was going to continue. Moreover, the unacceptance of the freely elected government of Iraq, Al-Qaeda types got involved. Iran is partly responsible for the conflict, and so on. Now, I thought that there were some fantasies from some of the neoconservatives. Some of this was over-optimistic, thinking that democracy could be introduced to Iraq and work perfectly first time. Richard Pearl notoriously said that within a year, there'd be a square in Iraq somewhere named in honor of Saddam Hussein. So he was ousted. The sanctions were lifted. Been under sanctions for ages. Now, Saddam Hussein had the oil for food program. Iraq could export only a small amount of its oil, and some money was paid. It could only be used for food and medicines, not just food, despite the name, to provide for the needs of the Iraqi people, as in to ensure that it wasn't going to be used to build up his armaments. Nevertheless, he didn't provide that for oil. He sold off the oil, the medicines and the food, deliberately starved people, deliberately deprived people of medical equipment, medicines, and so forth. So many people died agonizing and premature deaths, avoidably. And this was deliberately because of him. He was very happy to let naive foreign journalists tour the medical wards see the terrible suffering which he had caused purposefully. And then they were abetted often by the far left in Western countries to say this was somehow the fault of the United States, the UK, and so on, when Saddam Hussein was deliberately inflicting this agony on his own people. But anyway, the sanctions were lifted. Iraq is thriving. We often forget what went right. And yes, there have been some difficulties later on. ISIS came along. What would have happened had Saddam Hussein stayed in office? I'm not sure. Would he have lasted that long? Would he have died a natural death after 2006? Would his sons have carried on? Probably. Would ISIS have rebelled? Probably. Would they have been so successful? It becomes imponderable because he suddenly could have broken the chain of causation. There could have been Novus Actus Interveniens, another war against Iran, or whatever it is. So here we are. Anyway, I've always believed that the liberation of Iraq was absolutely the right thing to do. And yes, people got killed. That's what a war is. I know people got killed there. But perhaps should have waited a little bit longer. Would France have come on side? Would that United Nations Security Council resolution, the next one, have been passed? Something like that. Would Saddam Hussein have fully cooperated with the weapons inspectors? Maybe. But not as many WMD items were found in Iraq as might have been found. They could have been destroyed in bombardments during the war, deliberately destroyed. They may, just because they haven't been found doesn't prove they're not there, So you can't prove a negative. They may yet be found. But a lot of it was dismantled in the early 1990s, as it appears. But he's pursued this policy of strategic ambiguity, not having weapons of mass destruction largely, but giving the impression that he did, but was so imbecilic. Why would anyone do that? If you've got a WMD, the whole purpose is a deterrent to scare off would-be enemies. You ward them off because they think of the terrible havoc you can wreak on them by using these WMDs. There is a virtue to possessing them and your foe knowing that you possess them. There's a virtue in not having them and people knowing you don't have them, because then no action is going to be taken towards you in relation to them. But his policy was so illogical that nobody anticipated what he was actually doing. Anyway, so thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe, donate to me on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Okay, goodbye.